Wow, I can't believe it's already been a year since I last did this. Well, 2018 has finally come and gone. It's had plenty of good moments and plenty of bad moments, but who cares about the political or news bullshit? That's not what we're here to talk about today. It's time to get back into animated films, and in terms of what 2018 had to offer, there was slightly less movies than 2017, which makes it a lot easier for me to review these movies, but we also had plenty of sequels this year as well. Some good and some not so good. We also got a few surprising films that were actually pretty good, and a few that weren't so good. Which ones were they? Well, that's the whole point of this marathon. That's what I'm here to find out. To see which movies stand out, and which ones do not deserve to stand out. Just like last year, the rules still stand. If it's a theatrical movie, in any way, shape, or form, if it was released in a different country in theaters, then it counts as a theatrical animated film for me to talk about during this marathon. There may be a few movies you weren't expecting to see in this marathon, but they count as theatrical, so I'm going to be including them. So what are we waiting for? Let's do this. I'm Yoshi Player, and welcome back, folks, to the 2019 version of Animation Explosion. Kicking off the marathon is Aardman's latest film, at least until the next one, Early Man. Back when Aardman and DreamWorks used to be partners, they were both planning to make a caveman movie, but ever since then they split apart, and then they both made their own caveman movies. DreamWorks brought us The Croods, which was, at best, okay, and then Aardman brought us Early Man. It stars a group of cavemen who live together peacefully in a valley, just doing their usual thing, living together and being happy most of the time. But a governor takes over because he wants to start mining the area for bronze. So the leader, Doug, decides to make a deal with the governor that they should challenge each other to a football game between the Bronze Age and the Stone Age. If the Stone Age wins, their valley must be left alone, but if the Bronze Age wins, then the cavemen have to start mining for the governor. Considering this is a movie from Aardman, a studio that I'm very fond of, I think it's best that we start with the positives. The best thing about this movie, in my humble opinion, is the cavemen themselves. They're very happy, they're not rude to each other, they spend a lot of their time just working together and being, well, basically a happy family. The leader, Doug, is especially likable. He never thinks too little of himself or his tribe. He's a very inspiring character, hoping that him and his tribe can do way more than what they do. He never gives up, he never stops trying. He's a great character. We also get a female character who feels very unappreciated as a football player, and she starts to develop a bond with the cave people. When I first saw the trailer, I thought, oh great, it's gonna be another love interest, isn't it? But no, she's her own person, and I like that. Because of how likable and optimistic the cavemen are, I ended up cheering for them during the football game. They're just so likable and so charming. God, I love these guys. These are honestly a group of characters I just love to hang out with. Yeah, they're Neanderthals, but who gives a shit? They're amazing. So, what exactly is my problem with this movie? Well, I have a couple problems. For one thing, and I know this is going to sound a little shocking, but I didn't find this movie to be very funny. There's a messenger bird which is funny, especially the voice actor they got, but most of the jokes just don't work. That's because they try to rely on the traits of the characters, and it gets extremely repetitive. Sure, I like seeing these characters, but you don't need to copy the same gags for them over and over again. There's more to comedy than just how the characters act, guys. The villain in this movie is really pathetic. He's just too plain, and is another villain who, get this, just wants money. And because of that, I end up finding him extremely annoying, because when that's a villain's only motivation, I see nothing more than just a bland villain. What also sucks is that he's trying way too hard to be funny, and when most of the jokes aren't hitting, it's extremely irritating. But I think the biggest issue I have with this movie is that if you've seen plenty of sports movies, particularly the football ones, this movie is full of cliches. I just wish Aardman could have tweaked them a little bit and fleshed them out. But no, it's the same cliches I've seen so many times in other sports movies, and it doesn't feel fresh or new to me. All that culminates into a movie that is just simply okay for me. I don't hate this movie, but I don't think it's as strong as Aardman's other work, like Curse of the Were-Rabbit or Arthur Christmas. It does have some good parts, there were some jokes that were funny, I do like most of the characters, and it is overall very charming. I'd also say that it has a really good message as well, that isn't forced down your throat. But I just don't think that's enough to hold up for a strong movie, because while there were a few jokes that were kind of funny, most of them fell flat on their face due to how repetitive they can be, the villain is pathetic, pathetic, and the sports cliches get really annoying, especially since there's no tweaking done to them. If you're looking for a movie that is just simple and stupid in some way, then maybe you'll like this movie, and to be fair, I'd much rather watch this than The Croods, because at least this one has a better message and better characters. But I don't think that's enough to make it a strong movie. Yeah, I wouldn't mind rewatching it sometimes, but as a whole, all this movie reminded me is that I'm much better off not watching sports. I've never really been much of a Wes Anderson kind of guy. I mean, I've heard about the movies he's done, but never got around to watching most of them. However, there was Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I really enjoyed, so when the time came for Anderson to make another animated film, I was pretty excited, and he gave us Isle of Dogs. In the city of Megasaki, Japan, Mayor Kobayashi has banned all dogs to Trash Island, fearing an outbreak of dog flu. The mayor's nephew, named Atari, flies to the island to search for his dog Spots. He's assisted by 5 dogs, who vote to help him find Spots. Let's get this out of the way right here. The stop-motion animation is a sight for sore eyes. It's something that always captures my interest because so much effort goes into it. It's just always nice seeing an animated movie that isn't entirely CGI. Heck, this movie even has 2D animation at points. That's amazing. I miss those times. It's so good that you can feel the characters' emotions through their animated faces and how every hair moves on the dogs' bodies. You really feel the movement of this movie and you adore how charming it is. The story is original too, even though I've seen a few reviewers compare the message to Zootopia, saying how animals should be more respected. But I don't think this movie has quite the same thing. It's more about how humans should treat animals by showing a group of protesters believing that dogs being mistreated by the mayor is unfair. It's sort of like a metaphor to Donald Trump and how he treats immigrants. The difference being that Zootopia was more about how people should treat different races. This movie is more focused on how animals should be treated entirely. I can see the similarities, but I don't agree with it entirely. It also helps that the message is supported by a fantastic cast of characters, all with distinct looks and different personalities. They even have backstories that reveal some intriguing and emotionally gripping twists and character chemistries, particularly with the black dog Chief and Atari, and their bond in this movie is very emotional and a big highlight. Now, I can't talk about this movie without bringing up those that have accused this movie of having racial stereotypes. Knock it off. I don't consider this movie racist in any way. The numerous references to Japanese culture and form of clothes and settings, as well as spoken and written language, it's charming to me, honestly. This movie also has a PG-13 rating, well, in America anyway. I know the movie looks cutesy, but I will say this right now, Isle of Dogs is certainly not a movie for kids. Some of its dark themes and plot elements would likely be too complex and intense for most children of the age of 10 to understand. Plus, it gets pretty damn violent on occasion. There's like one scene in the movie where a dog's ear gets ripped off. Jesus. However, I won't lie and say that this movie is a complete masterpiece because there were some issues I had. Firstly, I found Mayor Kobayashi incredibly one-dimensional. They give him no believable reason for committing awful actions other than the fact that his family loves cats. So what that's basically saying is, cats are awesome, dogs suck, let's get rid of those slops. It's like the movie's telling me liking cats equals being pure evil. I am so freaking sick of the cats vs dogs trope. What is so bad about liking one side over the other? I have nothing against cats. I love cats, but I hate whenever a movie tries to make it seem like loving one side of animals is wrong. That actually kind of contradicts the message that this movie was going for, but I guess it's not that big of an issue. Secondly, this movie's focus on humans was just draining for me. It is important to the story and I won't knock it for that, but I feel like too much time was focused on them. Sometimes I feel like only 60% of this movie is focused on the dogs, which is not that great. But those are my only gripes with this movie. Isle of Dogs certainly deserves the praise it gets, and it's one of the best animated films of 2018. In fact, I only just noticed now that saying the title sort of sounds like I'm saying Isle of Dogs. Oh, I see what they did there. What's been up with this trend recently of just making random sequels to movies that didn't need sequels? We had Ice Age 5 in 2016, which was awful, The Nut Job 2 in 2017, which was actually a bit of a surprise for me in how average it was compared to awful, and now we have Sherlock Gnomes, the sequel to 2011's Romeo and Juliet. If you've never seen the original movie, then you're not missing out on much. It's just a kid-friendly version of Romeo and Juliet with garden gnomes. I didn't actually see the movie until around the time this movie came out in cinemas, and I found it surprisingly decent. Not great, just decent enough for kids. But this movie has been bashed to a bloody pulp for being cringy, unnecessary, and annoying. If that in part was thanks to the trailers, I can't blame anyone really. The trailers for the movie were just abysmal, and probably turned a lot of people off in wanting to see it. Since most people tend to see a trailer for a movie before watching said movie, it's gonna give them the impression that the movie itself is outright abysmal. After seeing it, I got exactly what I expected. Sherlock Gnomes isn't an awful movie, but it's just mediocre. In fact, I can't tell the age group this movie's aimed for, but I'll get to that later. The plot is about the gnomes moving to a new garden in London, until one day an evil villain kidnaps all the gnomes apart from Romeo and Juliet, until the well-known Sherlock Gnomes comes with his sidekick Watson to try and solve the case and see where all the gnomes were captured. Since this is a movie that gets so much hate from the viewing public, I decided to start with the positives. The animation easily has the most effort put into it. The gnomes' design and texture looks great, the backgrounds aesthetically fit the mood perfectly, the action scenes are engaging, characters like the gargoyles have good textures and nice designs, and my favorite thing about the whole movie, whenever it goes into Sherlock's mind, it has 2D animation instead of 3D. There's nothing to scream about unless it's something from Laika or Pixar, but the animators did the best with what they were given. Sherlock Gnomes and Watson are decent characters actually. In fact, I wish the movie was more focused on them. All the subplots do nothing for me, but if we took all these out and just had this as a Sherlock Holmes kids film, it could have actually been pretty decent. I know Sherlock can be a bit of an asshole throughout the film, but he did get a few laughs out of me, and Johnny Depp does do a good job, but I don't need to say who his voice reminded me of. That's really about it when it comes to the positives. The story is thin structurally and tends to hold few surprises and even less twists. Sure, there's like 2 twists that happen during the movie, but it's something that people can see coming a mile away. And much like Ice Age 5, this movie has way too many characters crammed in. Apart from the main story with Sherlock and Watson, too many subplots are involved that don't fit in this plot. I don't care if this is a sequel to Romeo and Juliet, there does not need to be this much character milking. There's a subplot where Romeo and Juliet are about to become the new leaders of the gnomes, and they spend most of the movie fighting about it. It goes absolutely nowhere and doesn't benefit anything. There's a subplot with Benny who has a crush on Nanette and he must confess that he loves her. It goes absolutely nowhere and, again, doesn't benefit anything. It also gets bonus points for being the most obnoxious plot on the whole movie because Nanette spends most of the time just screaming and shouting most of her dialogue. The problem is that I don't care about these subplots and seem like excuses to drag the movie to its runtime. Why couldn't it spend more time developing Gnomes and Watson's partnership? Why can't it give more Holmes lore to kids who may not know about it to begin with? Why can't it just focus on being a silly family film without a sappy romance and cringy modern slang? And need I bring up Moriarty, the main antagonist of the movie? Not only does his voice acting feel very lightweight compared to how he normally sounds.
Yeah, today's that day. Come, Sherlock. Come dance with me.
Reardon is the key to what Blackwood was doing. He's essential to my plan.
But design-wise, well, what the hell is he supposed to be? The movie claims he's a pie mascot, but he doesn't even look like one. Did Moriarty ever have some sort of connection to pies? Was that in his character? I don't know, because the movie never elaborates on it. It's too focused on trying to be hip and funny with the kids. While the writing isn't as bad as the trailer made it out to be, it can still get pretty damn annoying. I also hope this movie didn't get released in Asia, because there's an entire sequence dedicated to an Asian type restaurant, and I can see that feeling very offensive to people from the country. And this is considering the last film I looked at, Isle of Dogs, got more controversy than this movie could. And with all the problems I've been bringing up, it actually perfectly sums up my biggest flaw with Sherlock Gnomes. It doesn't seem to know what it's trying to do with itself. It tries to appeal to both children and adults, but it's tonally inconsistent that it loses track of itself very quickly. The film tends to be too childish for adults to the point where any bad joke will make them groan, but it's also confusing for younger audiences because most are probably unfamiliar with Sherlock Holmes, so they might find the Holmesian references going over their head. But I guess at the end of the day, Sherlock Gnomes is just mediocre. Not awful, but not good either. I don't hate it as much as the critics do, but I also didn't like it enough to consider it a guilty pleasure. If it had just focused on the adventure side with Holmes and Watson taking up 90% of the film's runtime, this could have actually been a decent movie for kids. But with all the pointless subplots, desperate attempts to seem modern, and uncomfortable amount of characters crammed into it, it's just a bland movie that I guess I can see kids enjoying, but just make sure they have headphones on while watching it. But if you really want your kids to see a good animated film with Sherlock Holmes at the forefront, I'd be better off watching The Great Mouse Detective instead. Sergeant Stubby, an American hero. Huh. Well, up until now, I didn't even know this movie existed. I heard it was released in a few theaters in America, but it never got a wide release here in Australia. But I guess since it counts as a theatrical animated film, I have to talk about it. Now, because I am an Australian, I didn't actually know much about this character or the stuff that actually happened during that time frame. But because I had to watch this movie, I decided, you know what, I might as well do a little bit of research. And from what I got, yeah, this is actually based on a true story. So let's see if it's actually anything faithful to what we actually got. The story focuses on a dog who served in the army, helping the Yankees fight off against the Germans during World War I. And the dog Stubby has a reputation of one of the most bravest dogs during the war. Right off the bat, I'll say I do like how this movie is really faithful to what happened. When I saw this movie and all the actions that Stubby does, I didn't have a hard time believing that this actually happened. It visually shows how he helped out in the war, how he's warning someone when a gas attack is about to happen, or when a soldier is injured. It does a great job showing the heroic acts of Stubby, and it does it faithfully. Even though this is a family-friendly movie, it won't hesitate to show some very serious stuff that happened during the war. The character of Stubby is a little hard to explain. He's not a talking dog, it's hard to get much of a personality out of him because he's just a dog. He's kind of a combination between a wartime dog and a house dog, which is fine, but again, it's hard to get any kind of personality out of him. As a character, there isn't much to him, but at the same time, I don't mind it because it's trying to show the realistic events of what happened in the past. It also has some very strong heartwarming moments between a man named Conroy and a man named Gaston Baptiste. They share some genuinely good moments with each other where they talk about their problems, their personal sides during downtimes. It's probably my favorite relationship in the entire movie because it makes them feel more three-dimensional. It's strong, it's sad, it's effective. It's kind of sad though because the main relationship in this movie is between Stubby and Conroy, and it's standard stuff. I didn't quite like it as much as the other one, but it's what I expected of this movie. My main issue with this movie is how the plot is executed. Because it's a family movie, it tries to sugarcoat all the things that actually happened during the war. I mean, sometimes they'll have a character being wounded and there's no blood. Come on, guys, you can't get away with that. As I said towards the beginning, if this movie was geared towards more an older audience, I think they could get away with some of this stuff a lot more and maybe it could have been a little bit more mature. But because it is a kids-friendly movie, I can't exactly see it as this perfect representation of what happened during the war. All I'm mostly seeing in this movie is a dog that's trying to help and some mild violence every now and then. Don't get me wrong, it had a lot of good stuff in it, and if I wanted to rewatch it, I definitely would, but I can't see it as a perfect or even a great movie when some of the stuff represented in it is kind of sugar-coated. I will say this though, it's definitely a way better kid-friendly wartime film than Valiant. That movie is so boring, at least this one managed to get across most of its portrayals fairly well. Not great, just well. If you're curious to check this movie out, go find it. It's probably not going to be hard to find. This will probably end up being one of those movies that you find at a DVD bin for like $5. I kind of wish something like that happened with Normal the North. But at least it was decent enough to where I would probably want to buy it. It's a decent kids movie. Again, I wish it wasn't a kids movie, but for what it got across, I think it did it alright. Goose. Just what is this? A Netflix animated film? Does that mean it technically counts as a movie for me to talk about during Animation Explosion? Well, as it turns out, Goose was originally supposed to be a theatrical animated film scheduled for release in April of last year, but it got pushed back to August, then all of a sudden out of nowhere, it didn't get released in theaters and was released on Netflix instead. So I question, why am I forced to review this in the first place? Well, actually, I know the answer, but it's really painful for me to say. This movie actually had a theatrical release here in Australia. So because of that, I'm forced to review this movie. And if it wasn't released in theaters, I wouldn't have any motivation to see it because, yeah, this movie's bad. I guess it's not awful, it's typical run-of-the-mill bad. It's hard to say whether this or Sherlock Gnomes is worse, but it's still bad. Not that that's really a surprise or anything. The film centers on a goose, I think it's a goose, some people say it's a gander, named Peng, voiced by Jim Gaffigan. He's often cited as being the weakest in his flock. He's not the fastest flyer, and he's even considered to send flying with the kids. But when his flock leaves without him, he ends up breaking his wing thanks to an incident with a gong, and runs into two ducklings named Chi, who's voiced by Zendaya, and Chow, who's voiced by Lance Lim. I don't even know who that is. And they're also separated from their flock thanks to the accident, and so now they all have to team up to find their way back to their homes, or so they think. Look, I really don't have a whole lot to say on this movie because this is just one of the most cliched movies I've ever seen. Everything that plays out in this movie plays out exactly as I thought it was going to go. Right when Peng meets these two ducklings, they decide to play the liar reveal trope, and it goes just as boring and annoying as I thought it was going to be. Why do people still think using this plot point is a good thing? As long as it's done well, like in How to Train Your Dragon, I can buy it, but it just doesn't fit. It never works. Most of the time it plays out the same. It needs to fit organically with the story, but it just doesn't here. It plays out typically, cliched, predictable, just like all the other times it's been used in other movies. Otherwise, the entire film is essentially a road trip movie, where characters have to embark on many dangerous obstacles while meeting some colourful yet obnoxious characters. You know, despite all the wacky situations that go on in this movie, it's actually one of the most boring road trip movies I've ever seen. Compare it to something like a Goofy movie. Yeah, it's not as wacky and over the top as this movie, but it didn't need to be. It was a chilling and relaxing, funny road trip movie. It didn't need to be cartoony, even though it was at points. It was still enjoyable and relaxing. A movie does not always need to be like this when it comes to its story. And why do you need to include all of these damn cliches in it? Can't we just for once have the characters learning something in different ways? The characters are just as cliched too. Peng is the typical unlikable asshole who doesn't care about anyone but himself, always getting himself into trouble, and I remind him that he is the reason why this whole thing is happening in the first place. If he hadn't have been such a stuck-up asshole, none of this bullshit would be happening. The ducklings are bland at best, but also have annoying tropes. Chi is the sassy, smart teenage character, and Chow is the fat, stupid one. Yeah, I haven't seen that before. And with a run-of-the-mill bad animated movie comes its fare of bad animated jokes, who might as well actually be just compared to how bad the ones are in Norm of the North. All the jokes are played as followed. There's butt jokes, there's fart jokes, and there's puking jokes. All the jokes in this movie are toilet humor. Like, I can't think of one joke that wasn't involve someone farting. Well, there's actually one other source of humor, but it's a little unneeded. There's also physical humor. There's plenty of times where the characters are constantly being abused to hell, or being hurt in several ways. It especially happens when Peng is paired up with the ducklings. There are so many times where he just looks like he's outright abusing them. You can't even say the animation looks that great. Sure, the backgrounds are kinda nice, but it's very generic and, again, bland. It's so boring to look at. It doesn't scream beauty. It's like you're looking at toast. Except it's probably more interesting to look at because you can actually do something with it. Not even the voice acting sounds like it's trying that much. With the exception of Zendaya and Gaffigan, who do an okay job in this movie, everybody else just sounds like they don't care. In fact, it feels like no effort or passion was even put into this project to begin with. So I asked the question, what exactly was the point of this movie being made? It didn't feel like anything special, or there wasn't even anything remarkable about it to begin with. You know, as bad as something like the Emoji Movie is it stood out for a reason because of how bizarrely bad it was. This is just bland. Like, it doesn't do anything particularly awful to me. Nothing offensive, nothing shocking, it's just that. A bland, boring, forgettable movie. I'm almost not surprised that this movie wasn't released in theaters because it wasn't a movie that deserved to be released in theaters. Honestly, I wouldn't even say this movie is good enough to show to your kids, because there are some scenes in this movie that seem outright inappropriate for kids. Not just the violence that I brought up earlier, but there's also the climax where they're trying to escape from a restaurant where the ducklings are going to be cooked up. When I read some reviews on IMDb regarding that scene, some people said their kids were actually crying during those scenes. So no, I wouldn't even say show this movie to your kids. If they're just gonna get bored or scared of it, then what's the point? I question this movie's age rating because it doesn't certainly seem like family-friendly entertainment. And you certainly gotta put quotations in entertainment because Duck Duck Goose has got to be one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. I definitely don't think it's as bad as Normal the North, because it doesn't have this, but I certainly don't recommend it, and you'd probably be better off if you just skipped the damn thing. Pixar's made a lot of sequels this decade. We've had a few sequels for Cars, we've had a prequel to Monsters Inc., we've had a sequel to Finding Nemo, and now it's The Incredibles' turn, with Incredibles 2. I, like a lot of people, was really excited about this movie. I love the original Incredibles. It's one of my all-time favorite Pixar movies, maybe even in top 3. So I was really looking forward to seeing how this movie would turn out. At the same time though, I was a little worried given Pixar's track records of sequels, but I can safely say that after watching this movie, I think it was a worthy follow-up to the original. Now, I didn't love it as much as the original, but I did still have a lot of fun with it. The film takes place literally where the first film ends, where the Incredibles are fighting the Underminer, but superheroes are still illegal, and the Incredibles are worried that they may have to go back into hiding. However, an eccentric man named Winston is a big fan of superheroes, and he plans to make superheroes legal again by filming Elastigirl going on a quest to defeat the villain known as Screenslaver, while Mr. Incredible is left home to watch the kids while discovering that Jack Jack is starting to form his new superpowers. Like in the first movie, I found the characters to be extremely likable, and the one thing I liked that this movie does that the first movie kind of missed was that it has a much bigger focus on the family. The first one was more focused on Mr. Incredible and his midlife crisis, but this one focuses on the entire family. Yeah, Elastigirl is in the A plot, but the B plot has plenty of time as well. We get to see the problems that the kids are having, we have focus on Jack Jack with his powers, and we see Mr. Incredible struggling to be a good father. I saw some people take issue that this movie distracts us with all of these pointless scenes, but we have to remember that The Incredibles isn't just a superhero movie. Even the first film was like that. It's allowed to focus on real family drama, and I thought this movie handled that aspect really well. And even when we're not focusing on the family, the stuff with Elastigirl is so much fun. The action scenes, while they are a little faster than in the original, are still so much fun. I love seeing her doing all these cool things. There's a scene where she chases after a train and her motorbike can detach and she can stretch all over it. It's so much damn fun. And that's one thing I also love about this movie. The animation is gorgeous. It's definitely a step up from the original, and you can tell, given how the characters look slightly more polished and the action is way faster, it definitely looks better than the original, and it really shows. This movie is also really funny. In fact, I'd argue maybe even funnier than the first movie. There are so many gags and one-liners in this movie that I was in stitches. There was also a lot of great scenes with Jack Jack too. There's really funny scenes involving Edna, and there's a scene where he fights a raccoon, and it had me in so many stitches. I was laughing so hard, I think the whole theater kind of heard me. It's actually one of the few sequences where I love seeing the baby in the movie. But as I said at the start of this video, I don't quite like this movie as much as the first movie, and there are a couple of reasons why. This first problem may not be much of a problem to you guys, but when I first saw this movie, I had some serious issue with its epilepsy. Now, you may not notice it today, because the movie actually edited out these problems, but when the movie first came out, there were a lot of scenes involving the screenslaver with flashing images, and it was really distorting for me. It almost gave me a migraine from watching it. I have serious problems with this. Not seizure problems, but I always get migraines whenever I see flashing images during a movie, especially since it was in the big screen with the lights turned off. It was not helping me at all, and I had to cover my eyes while I was watching it. It was not a pleasant time for me. I mean, did Pixar seriously not think that something like this was going to happen? There were even reports that people got seizures during this movie. How did they not think something like this was going to happen? As much as I liked seeing the inclusion of new superheroes in this movie, I thought they were really underused. Aside from a new character named Void, who's kind of an Elastigirl eccentric, the other superheroes don't really get much screen time or development. Yeah, they look cool, their powers are cool, but they don't get much development. I hope we get a spin-off with these guys, because I think they had potential. But my biggest issue with this movie, and I think you guys know where I'm going with this, is the villain. We know who it's going to be. As soon as the character shows up, the villain wants to keep superheroes illegal, which makes no sense because superheroes are already illegal to begin with. And if this character wanted superheroes to be illegal from the start, then why was this character having any input when Elastigirl was actually being a good role model for superheroes? It makes no sense. It's amazing how often Disney and Pixar try to make their villains less predictable and end up making them more predictable. On the whole though, I really enjoyed Incredibles 2. I can definitely see it as one of Pixar's best sequels that's not a Toy Story movie. I enjoy the characters, I love the action, the animation, and the comedy was great. Yeah, it didn't have a very good villain, which was a shame because the first film had an amazing villain, but I thought the rest of the film more than made up for it. Yeah, it has a few problems, but that doesn't stop this movie from simply being... Yeah, I know, I'm sorry. Hotel Transylvania as a franchise has been very polarizing for many people. It's a series of movies people either love or hate. I'm somewhat mixed on the movies. The first was just alright for me, nothing that amazing, and the second film was just mediocre at worst. But I have praised each movie for their distinct animation styles and great cast of characters. Yeah, I know Dracula can be a bit of an asshole, especially in the second movie, but I enjoy these characters and the chemistry they have with each other. So now that a third movie is here, how does it hold up? Dracula is running his hotel business as usual, but he sometimes drifts into depression from remaining single for so long. So his daughter Mavis arranges a cruise to give everyone a break and let the family spend more time together. And the ship itself is destined to vacation to the lost city of Atlantis. On board the ship, Dracula falls in love with the ship's captain, Erica, but Mavis begins to suspect that she's up to something sinister. It turns out that she's the great-granddaughter of Van Helsing, who's been wanting to kill Dracula for so long, and since Dracula's caught his eyes on her, Helsing wants Erica to kill Dracula as well as all the other monsters on the ship. The plot itself is really nothing that amazing to me. It feels very predictable, and don't get me wrong, predictability is never a bad thing as long as the execution is fun and enjoyable, and I think that's where Hotel Transylvania 3 shines the most. Plot-wise, it's not a standout, but what we get in between is pretty decent. The animation is great as always, vibrantly colourful and greatly detailed. The character designs are once again very distinct and unique to help make each character stand out. Dialogue is witty and jokes hit just right. It's a little hit and miss, but more good jokes stand out than the bad ones in my opinion. My favourite joke in the whole movie was the villain's plan in general. He wants to bring the monsters on a cruise ship and bring them to a location that will literally kill them. Call the protagonist stupid, but that's funny. And my favorite thing about the trilogy still stands. The chemistry between the characters is still great. I love seeing Dracula hanging out with his friends. It's just so relaxing and nice to me. Seeing them having fun together and playing off one another is a joy to watch. The romance between Dracula and Erica is very sweet. I am somewhat annoyed that the movie kind of goes into the liar reveal trope, which is one I can't stand. But it's nowhere near as bad as it was in movies like A Bug's Life or Duck Duck Goose. I don't have a hard time believing they're in love. It's genuine development. The film is not without its faults. It certainly has its forced and trendy moments that were kind of painful to watch, such as the main characters dancing to popular music, and a climax that didn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, seeing all the characters dancing to the Macarena was just cringe. And I may have just had a ton of praise earlier on for the humor, but even I'll admit the movie sometimes tries to be too silly, almost to the point where it's hard to take anything seriously. I don't really know what else I can say about this movie because I didn't get a lot out of it. Hotel Transylvania 3 is simply just another sequel on top of a polarizing franchise that I do have a soft spot for, but won't hesitate to call out its faults. And given that there's now a fourth movie coming out in 2021, I doubt this series is going to end anytime soon. I don't love it, it has plenty of problems that are cringe to me, but I see this as a perfectly fine movie for kids to enjoy. A bit hard to consider this a family movie due to the amount of times it tries to be silly, but I think some people can get into it. If you didn't like the previous two movies, I doubt this one will change your mind, but I see it decent enough to have a second ride.
Place your dead king deep inside, and that's the end!
I don't think Teen Titans Go needs an introduction. Everybody knows about this cartoon, and everybody hates it, saying it's a terrible representation of the original show, saying it's a disgrace to those who actually liked the original show. I've had a history with the show, talking about it many times in the past, even putting it as my worst cartoon in my original top 10 worst cartoons video list, but that video is outdated and terrible, so I'm just going to choose to ignore that. Today, I think the show is just bad. Not terrible, not offensive, just stupid babysitter fodder. So when it came for the time to the Teen Titans to actually get their own movie based on the spin-off show, I was skeptical. On the one hand, I didn't like the show, so I doubted this movie was going to be anything amazing. But then when I saw the second trailer for the movie, I thought, you know, maybe there's actually some hope for this one. And after finally deciding to put my foot down and see it last year, I gotta say, from what I got, this was not what I was expecting to get. The Teen Titans want to get their own movie to prove that they are real superheroes. The problem is, nobody takes the Teen Titans seriously. So they get into some wacky situations, as well as coming across a villain known as Slade, in order to get their own movie. Okay, so my first worry going into this movie was that the Teen Titans themselves were going to be really annoying. That is a main problem that happens throughout the show. But I can safely say that outside of a few scenes where the Teen Titans are in your face, I didn't find them that annoying in this movie. They are capable of being superheroes, they're good friends to each other, and they're not stupid. If they were, that would have been a different story, but not in this case. They're likable, they are funny, they are capable of being good superheroes. They're not so bad here. And even if there was a point where the Teen Titans were acting childish, I didn't mind it so much because it plays in favor of the plot. That nobody takes the Teen Titans seriously. Even the long fart joke in the movie, it actually plays a role in explaining how these guys can't be taken seriously. Even a fart joke did that correctly. I haven't seen a movie do that since Shrek 2. Whenever the movie has something to mock, it's usually towards themselves. Like I said, the Teen Titans aren't taken seriously, which is a metaphor for how often the show is criticized as that, the Teen Titans just being stupid. And thankfully, unlike in the show, where it's more crammed down your throat, it's a lot more subtle here, so that's nice. It all culminates into the message that the Teen Titans may be stupid and can't be taken seriously, but that doesn't mean they can't kick some serious ass. That's a subtle be yourself message. I mean, it's done a lot better here than in the Emoji Movie. So, about the comedy. The other thing that I was really worried about, given how the show isn't really great at doing this. There are a couple of toilet humor modern slang and stuff like that, but others do play into the plot, which fits, and most of the other jokes are funny as well. There's a Stan Lee cameo, too soon, and he realizes he's in a DC movie, not a Marvel movie. That's funny, especially if you're someone who's paid attention to that. Like I said before, most of the jokes do play into the fact that the Teen Titans are very insecure, and most of the jokes are also brilliantly timed, including a particular scene when the Teen Titans go back in time to fix the mistakes that they've done, which involve pushing Batman's parents into the alley where they are shot, and Robin gives a huge smile on his face as well as a thumbs up. This scene had me in so many stitches. It was so brilliantly timed. And that's what I like most about this movie. It's not so in your face. Everything feels like it's supposed to be stupid, but it's not. It actively acknowledges that what they're doing is stupid, but they don't care. They can do a lot of cool stuff with it. If I did have one minor complaint with this movie, is that I wish the animation was a little stepped up. I mean, it looks fine, especially on the big screen, but I kind of wish the budget was a little bigger. I mean, the action scenes look good, the characters don't look terrible, but given that this is a cinematic movie, they could have at least raised the budget a little bit. Overall though, I would say the Teen Titans Go movie is a lot of fun. It's not an award winner or anything, but it's not trying to be. The movie is very subtle, it's funny, the characters are at least likable, it has the predictable elements and emotional moments, but they are done well here. It's not the best superhero satire movie I've seen. I mean, movies like Lego Batman and Deadpool 2 are way funnier than this. But for the Teen Titans' first theatrical film, I thought they did a good job with it. Yeah, I'm kind of annoyed that the original movie never got a theatrical release, yet this did. But hey, the movie's good, and that's all that matters to me. You know what's funny? When it comes to Warner Brothers, they always manage to surprise me with an animated film. I mean, I thought the Lego movie would suck, but it turned out to be an amazing movie, and I just reviewed the Teen Titans Go movie, which was way better than it had any right to be. Why do I bring this up? Because Smallfoot is another one of those movies. I don't really get why some reviewers don't like this movie. No discredit to them at all, but I was genuinely surprised by how much I liked this movie. It centers on a Yeti named Migo, voiced by Channing Tatum, who discovers a mystical creature known as the Smallfoot, who's essentially us. He believes they now exist after he comes across one, but everyone, including their leader the Stonekeeper, banishes Migo for not following the rule. But he comes across a Yeti group known as the Smallfoot Evidentiary Society, led by the ruler's daughter. They believe in Smallfoot too, and have plenty of evidence to prove so. But Migo wants to actually show everyone a Smallfoot, and luckily he runs into another human named Percy, voiced by James Corden, who also wants to catch a Yeti for fame and fortune. On the surface level, Smallfoot's story is very generic. It's basically another does this thing really exist plot, only with it being swapped around as humans being the unknown. But this movie is not what you think it's going to be. It sounds that way, but the execution makes this movie way better than it has any right to be. That's all thanks to its message, which teaches the audience the importance of trust, the questioning of theories to persuade truth and make life better, and bringing cultures together to make for peace. It's powerfully done, with all the magic thrown in to help bring the message to full light and let it fully settle in. It shows the importance of outer appearance in the society, both in digital and in real life, the way of how judgment comes and gives values, something that I think could be so related to society that we know of as today. What helps to back this up is the characters. Admittedly, I don't really remember the name of most of them, but they had distinct designs and are likable enough to the point where I did care about them. Migo is a good character who can be seen as relatable. He tries to find the good in finding the truth and doesn't want anyone in the village to be harmed. The interactions between Migo and the human Percy are pretty dang funny, and I like how the movie doesn't include a female character just for the sake of a love interest. Even though the movie does have a comic relief, they actually abandon him at one point because he's annoying. Fuck him. That was brilliant. Animation-wise, it's solid. The colors are vibrant, backgrounds do the job fine, nice little details and imagination like the hair on the Yetis, and design-wise the characters look great too. In fact, that's probably what I remember most about all of them, just how they look. Believe it or not, this movie is also a musical. Though none of them struck a chord with me, there's one song from Common that sounds like Be Prepared that was great, but most suffer a similar problem with the My Little Pony movie. They all pretty much sound the same and blend in together too much. There's even a Let It Go-esque song that's much easier to listen to compared to the actual Disney song, but that shouldn't be the only reason to like a song. One thing this movie lacks to me is the comedy, which is odd considering this studio also did Storks, which was a consistently funny movie to me. I like some of the jokes in this movie. Like I said, the interactions between Migo and Percy were great, and the instance of Migo launching himself to a gong to wake the sun up was really funny, but the movie fails to find a balance between too much comedy and too little. The movie loves beating running gags to death, and has lots of physical comedy that's very hit and miss. Plus, the movie is more focused on storytelling and morals, so it doesn't give the writers enough time to do really good jokes all throughout. I mean, I can't think of any joke that was terrible, but not enough that was actually funny. I'm also not a fan of the voice acting. Nobody does a bad or cringy job, but nobody sounds distinct. This is a common problem I have with most animated films where producers feel the need to hire celebrities rather than actual voice actors. I love Danny DeVito and Common, but everyone else sounds about the same for me. You know, of all the animated films released this year, Smallfoot was one that exceeded my expectations along with the Teen Titans Go movie. It had a brilliant message, good storytelling, simple yet likable characters, solid animation, and it's very smart. It's not groundbreaking, but don't let this movie's cutesy nature fool you into thinking it's stupid because it really isn't. Smallfoot is good, not great, but good enough. And as a movie with the themes of snow, I'll take this over Frozen any day of the week. I'm just gonna be honest right here, right now. The 2018 Grinch film from Illumination is awful. I'm not saying this because you think I'm some biased Illumination hater or I don't like book adaptations or something like that. No. I can perfectly buy an adaptation from a book as long as it's done right. But The Grinch has got to be one of the worst adaptations from a book that I have ever seen in my life. I cannot begin to describe how annoyed I was feeling while I was watching this movie at the cinema. I'm honestly ashamed that I had to pay $12 to see this movie. I gave them money for this worthless, unnecessary film from a story that was already fine enough on its own. Okay, I need to calm myself down. Before we actually get into anything extreme, I suppose we should talk about what this movie is actually about. For those of you who have never heard of The Grinch before, it's the story about this green, hairy man who lives on the mountain and he hates Christmas. He hates it when it's celebrated, so he decides that he's going to steal Christmas from Whoville, run by these people known as the Who. So when you lay that story out on a piece of paper and plan that for a movie, it doesn't sound so bad. And it's right, because the original story was fine on its own, so turning it into a movie is a very difficult thing to do given that the story was only a few pages long and now you're turning it into an hour-and-a-half movie. But at the very least you gotta at least make sure that everything makes sense, everything that's a part of the story is there so that we understand the message and point of it. But with this movie, they take that plot and turn it into something absolutely pointless. So before I actually get to that, let's talk about a few minor things. Visually speaking, this movie looks admittedly gorgeous. It's probably the best looking movie that Illumination has ever done. All the effort into the art style, the colors, the designs, it all looks really good and I think this is very Seuss-like in many ways. However, I'm not a fan of how the Grinch actually looks. He doesn't look like the Grinch that's described in the song. He doesn't look like the same one that I've become associated with in the original story. He looks very clean and soft, which is not exactly the kind of Grinch I'm expecting to see most of the time. The instrumental soundtrack is okay. It's not one of the best things Danny Elfman's done, but I think it sounds fun enough. That being said, the actual songs in this movie are pretty damn awful. I mean, there's a fucking rap version of the Grinch song. It's gonna become dated. It's annoying, and I hate it whenever they do this. This movie also has a B-plot involving Cindy Lou from the original story. Now, in the original story, she was just mostly a 2-year-old little girl who wasn't really a main character, but was important to the story. In this film, nope, she's a main character, and honestly, she doesn't really feel very important to the story. Her B-plot involves her wanting her single mum to be less depressed on Christmas because she works so hard. And instead of the innocent 2-year-old girl we got in the original story, they turned her into a very sporty, energized girl who reminds me of one of the girls from Despicable Me. There is nothing wrong with making a relatable kid character who acts normally. By having them acting all sporty and energetic, that's not exactly going to be relatable to all age groups. And while the scenes with Cindy Lou and her mum are admittedly adorable, these scenes also fail to show me exactly how her mum is depressed. She barely looks depressed in this movie. Most of the time, she's a very happy, full of life mother. There's like 2 scenes in the beginning where she's looking frustrated or sleepy, but that's it. After that, she looks perfectly fine. So I have a hard time believing that she's even depressed to begin with. Okay, so taking that all in, it doesn't sound like that bad of a movie, right? Well, to me, there's 2 things that completely ruin this movie for me: the point of the story and the characterization of the Grinch. In the original story, the Grinch hated Christmas because of the greed. He thought that all the Who's loving Christmas was all greedy, and that's all they cared about, and that's what really annoyed him. So he thought, if I steal Christmas, then we'll see how they celebrate Christmas now. And maybe, just maybe, the Who's will actually celebrate Christmas without all those toys and food, because maybe Christmas means a little bit more. That's the whole point of the original plot. But in this movie, they completely killed that. Like, they threw it out the window and into a trash can. The main point of this movie is that the Grinch is sad. He was alone on Christmas. He was an orphan. That's why he hated Christmas. He was just alone. He wanted to celebrate Christmas like all the other kids. And look, I have nothing wrong with a movie changing up its story to fill in a new runtime. You know, maybe they want to offer a new way of experiencing the story that's not necessarily all 100% predictable like you thought it would be. The problem is that they still implying that, oh, he's very miserable because maybe his heart is way too small, but he's actually not like that throughout the movie. And that brings me on to my second problem. It's the Grinch's characterization. In the original story, and I know I've said this a lot throughout this review, he's, well, a Grinch. He's an unredeemable asshole who abuses his dog and wanting to get his way. He's a very unredeemable character, but he's not like that in this movie. He's a very level-headed, calm, nice character. I mean, sure, he can do asshole things sometimes, but he's not like a great, unredeemable asshole. He kind of reminds me of Gru from Despicable Me. So it's incredibly hard for me to believe that his heart grew 3 sizes towards the end, because nothing about him changes. He acted exactly the same throughout the whole movie. He was not this unredeemable person. There's plenty of scenes where he's like, "Aw, that's very nice," or "Oh, I like that," and plenty of scenes where he's being nice to his dog Max. So the question is, why are you implying that the Grinch is very miserable and he hates everything when you're also going to miss the point of the story to begin with? That's annoyingly inconsistent. You know, I may not like the Jim Carrey Grinch that much, and I will admit it also kind of misses the point of the story as well, by having the Grinch being bully being the main reason he hates Christmas. That's not exactly the point. But at the very least in that one, the Grinch actually felt like a Grinch, and by the time his heart actually grew 3 sizes, I believed it, which is not the case with this movie. Not only do they try to change the Grinch's personality, but by trying to keep that same story in there, while also trying to offer a different point on what this story is supposed to mean, it's inconsistent. It may think it's telling the story fine, but it's really not to me. It feels like a bastardized version of the Grinch, one that I would not follow at all. That's why I hate this movie so much, because it feels so inconsistent, while also shoving in all of this pointless stuff that does not matter to the story. If you're gonna change things about it, then don't bother. There's no point. The Grinch on its own is fine. Did it really need a movie? I'm sure there's dozens of books you could have turned into movies, and maybe they could have actually been really good, but no, let's just make an adaptation of the Grinch because everybody loves the Grinch. Honestly, at the end of the day, I see this movie as nothing more than a joke. It does not feel like a movie to me. It doesn't feel like the same story. It all feels like a Robot Chicken sketch that was stretched out to an hour and a half, except it's geared towards kids. If you're someone who's never seen this movie before, and whether you're a die-hard Grinch fan or not, just don't bother. Don't bother watching this movie. In fact, I'd rather prefer watching the Jim Carrey version, which, again, despite not being good, at least did other things better than how this movie did it. I'm always gonna love the original Grinch story, continue watching the original Chuck Jones short many times, but I won't have this movie to thank for that story. Well, Pixar got out their sequel this year. Now it's Disney's turn. After, what, 18 years? It's WreckIt Ralph 2, Ralph Breaks the Internet. I love the original film. In fact, if it wasn't for Zootopia, it would probably be my favorite Disney animated film of the decade, not counting anything from Pixar. So I, like a lot of people, was really excited to see a sequel being made to it. Admittedly, the trailers didn't do a lot for me, and I was worried there wasn't going to be much of a plot. But then the last trailer came out, and you know what? I was hooked again. So I went on in, paid my ticket, watched the movie. Oh boy. I'm just wondering how many subscribers I'm going to be having by the time this video is done. It's been 6 years since the last movie, and Ralph and Vanellope are spending most of the nights together as best friends, just kinda fucking around in other arcade games. But Vanellope's getting very tired of her game, saying everything is too boring and that nothing much interesting really happens. So Ralph decides to make her a shortcut for her to race on, but she ends up taking control in the middle of an arcade race, causing the player to break the steering wheel, making the game unplugged and all of its citizens homeless. Ralph and Vanellope decide to venture into the internet in order to find a replacement part before the game is removed entirely, which is filled with a bunch of users, different games, and countless websites that you'll probably recognize. It's no surprise that when this movie was announced, it reminded a lot of people of the Emoji Movie. Now, compared to the two, I don't think this movie is nearly as bad as the Emoji Movie, but then again, given my recent thoughts on the film, that's actually not really saying a lot. But this movie still has plenty of problems to make me not enjoy it that much. As much as the internet branding isn't as bad or prominent as it was in the Emoji Movie, it's still really distracting whenever it shows up, particularly an entire scene dedicated to the Oh My Disney website, which I'm just gonna admit, I didn't like one bit. I mean, look, I get it. A lot of people really like this part, but I personally didn't care. It just feels like an excuse for Disney to shove in as much content as they want, because hey, Disney's the biggest brand in history. Gotta remind people of that throughout an entire sequence. Much praise to Disney giving more recognition to the Muppets, but seriously, this entire scene felt very shallow. Ralph and Vanellope end up bidding really high on the steering wheel at eBay, so now they have to make videos on BuzzTube, yeah, I wonder what that was based off of, in order to make money to buy the steering wheel. But when it comes to the video editing part of this movie, I think it's going to teach some messages that kids won't fully understand. You see, in order for people on BuzzTube to make money, they have to get a bunch of hearts, which is basically the equivalent of likes. But why exactly would they pay me to have likes on my videos? They also tried to over-glorify the internet while also making it seem like it's a dangerous place to be on. They have this scene where Ralph is reading comments on his videos that personally hurt his feelings, and then the movie says that he shouldn't read the comments, even though the movie's already over-glorifying on making money based off of making videos. This movie feels incredibly inconsistent with how you should be making videos. Why can't this movie teach kids that YouTube isn't just about making money, but that they can make some passionate projects? I mean, I know I make money off YouTube, but I don't do that just for the money. I like to make animations and reviews. What fun would I get out of just making money? What, does the movie think everybody out there is some kind of snob? And am I the only one that cringed at some of these videos that Ralph was making, just because they seem like trends on popular stuff that exists today, like all these prank videos or Ralph flossing? I mean, there's so much modern references in this movie that they even have a visual reference to Fortnite. God, for crying out loud. Now, I was willing to ignore all of that as long as the friendship plotline was at least done well. I mean, it was one of the best things about the first movie to me, but no, they made that worse as well. Now, I do think this movie has a really good message about how you shouldn't be clingy to your friends and that you should let them do whatever they want, even if it's something that changes their lives or even your life. But how this movie executes it felt very off to me. Why? Because they turned Ralph into an insecure, clingy, idiotic moron. This does not feel like the same character from the first movie. Yeah, Ralph wasn't always the brightest in the first movie, but he at least had a brain. He didn't just care about himself, he was smart, he was sometimes cynical. He felt very natural for me. But he doesn't feel like the same character in this movie because he's extremely possessive over Vanellope, which leads to one of the worst fucking scenes in the whole movie where he decides to terrorize Slaughter Race, the game that Vanellope falls in love with, just to get her to come back to the arcade. And I don't see this as a simple mistake, I see this as outright terrorism. But Ralph isn't the only one who got on my nerves in this movie. I also couldn't stand Vanellope. Now yes, Vanellope was always kind of a brat in the original movie, but she at least cared about other people. In this movie, she's incredibly selfish. Whatever her concern is, it's only regarding herself. She doesn't care about anyone else. She only seems to be fighting back for the game just to make herself satisfied. She never seems concerned for the rest of the people of Sugar Rush. And plus, at the end of the first movie, she was actually the princess, or I guess in her case, president of Sugar Rush. So shouldn't she at least be more concerned about everybody else? I mean, there's one scene in the movie where she outright admits that Ralph being her friend isn't enough for her. That's really mean. I mean, he tried to help her be a part of Sugar Rush in the first movie. That seems a little unnecessary, and it just didn't feel right to me. Nothing in this movie feels right. And now that the characterization of Ralph and Vanellope and the friendship plotline is handled so badly in this movie, it's a shame to see one of my favorite things about the first movie botched down to such an incredibly awful level. And then there's the ending. Oh boy. Okay, so I know I just had a ton of praise for the message earlier on, but even I'll admit how the movie actually ended it off seemed very rushed to me. And this was something my good friend Cleve brought up. He brought up that at the end of the movie, they should have done what Ralph and Vanellope did by voice chatting with each other, but instead do that with Vanellope and Shank. He didn't think she was ready to leave yet, and he thought it felt very out of character. And this is something I absolutely agree on. Her friendship with Ralph seems very important to her, so you'd think that she would have to think really hard about wanting to stay or not, but the fact that she just stays on day one with no thought seems very selfish to me. Like Cleve said, they should have had it to where Vanellope isn't quite ready to leave yet, but she'll have visits every so often so that she can get used to it, and that by maybe a third movie, she's finally ready to go because she's had enough time to think about it. I think that would have made for a very good message in the third movie. This is something that happens in real life. You may see something and you want to change, but you need time to think about it. When it's time to move on, just move on. Remember the good times. And that's something that I think a lot of people should know, because at the end of the day, you may not be instantly ready for something to change. I think that would have been a really good message. It's just a shame how the movie ended felt so forced, and once again, out of character. More of a reason for me to not like Vanellope in this movie. And there's still plenty of other small problems as well. I don't think this movie was very funny. I mean, the auction scene didn't get a laugh out of me because I figured they would at least know what money is, given that they pay money at tappers, for some strange reason. There's a B-plot involving Felix and Calhoun having kids, but that's quickly tossed to the side and just seems like it's only there for jokes. And I'm gonna be honest, I did not like the scenes with the Disney princesses. I know everybody loves these, and that's fine, but I just couldn't care for them. Not just because I had to spend some time seeing Ariel and Elsa again, two of the Disney princesses I cannot stand for the life of me, but these scenes just weren't that funny to me. I'm also a little annoyed that they act like they don't need men in their lives and that they're strong on their own, when some of them actually had men that made their lives better. Seems a little contradictory, doesn't it? Disney, if you want to poke fun at yourself, do it with the characters who actually fought hard by themselves. So with all these really big problems, WreckIt Ralph 2 must be a bad movie, right? Well, not necessarily. The animation is still gorgeous, the environment in the internet world looks great, I love how all the users are kind of like these little me figures, and there's nice little references everywhere as well. The way the movie looks is visually appealing. The climax involving the giant Ralph monster is pretty cool, although I wondered, where did that virus go? The one that's causing all the insecurity problems. It just disappears and it's never clarified what actually happened to it. These pros just ultimately can't save this movie for me, and that's a damn shame. I wanted to like this movie like everybody else, I really did, but it disappointed me all throughout. There are things I like about it, but ultimately not enough for me to want to see this movie again. I guess I'm at least grateful that the first movie exists so I can just go back and rewatch that again, because thanks to that, I think I'd much rather just have this movie deleted from my browsing history. It's time to wrap up Animation Explosion 2019 with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I mean, what can I even say about this movie? Everybody has praised it to death. I feel like I've been wasting our time with this. There was so much hype going into this movie the second the first teaser trailer was released. The animation, the colors, the style, the speed. It had me drooling for more. I was so excited for this movie that I went to go see it day one. Sure, I may have had to endure a large crowd, and that's never fun when you're seeing a movie at the cinema, but it was worth it. If this is Sony's apology for the Emoji Movie, then I forgive them. We centre on a teenager named Miles Morales, a very down-on-his-luck person who gets bitten by a radioactive spider. He begins to develop the same powers as Spider-Man, but said Spider-Man was killed by Kingpin, who's using a powerful collider to bring his family back from the dead. However, this collider has been causing strange things to happen, and now Spider-Men and Spider-Women have showed up from other dimensions in Miles' world. They all must now train Miles to become the new protector of the city, and stop Kingpin before the collider does disastrous results. So before I get to anything, I want to address something to those that fear the movie's setup. It's another coming-of-age story that has a superhero theme to it, and with the large cast of characters, I understand how worried some newcomers may be. Thankfully, the script not only keeps every character in check, but it also makes a great story for young Miles. It may sound obvious, but this movie does so much to make it stand out from the other similar stories. In fact, it does it so well that it makes this Spider-Man movie stand out much more than the rest. Yeah, I may love Homecoming, but I don't think I could even compare that to how good this one was. And it all comes down to how relatable I find this movie. Miles is one that many can relate to, someone who's struggling to find their purpose in life but is ready to accept new challenges for the greater good, and seeing him explore the themes of family and courage is astonishing. Combined with a beautiful message for the audience to take in, the conflict and journey for Miles is executed beautifully, and is one that you don't often see in most animated movies. And of all the adaptations of Peter Parker in film, this one is probably my favorite, because he isn't just a perfect living superhero, he's a human being, a Spider-Man, someone who's gone through so much and had his heart broken several times, that he's more of a broken hero that needs fixing himself. His story is balanced perfectly with Miles' coming-of-age plotline, and need I say anything more about the other Spider heroes? Their company I greatly appreciate, and they contribute so much to the movie's story and sense of humor. Visually speaking, I mean, what can I say? I was drooling at the amount of effort gone into the animation style. Instead of it going for the traditional 3D animation set by Pixar, it blends all kinds of animation into one. Comic book style, graffiti, 2D animation, and going for a visually stunning aesthetic. It feels like an actual comic book movie. There's outlines and text boxes, and sometimes it will have lower frame rates during the calm moments, and then get super smooth when action is involved. And oh yeah, the action! You can get so lost in what's going on because you're drawn into so much on screen. I felt like I wasn't able to breathe after getting through this style. The vibrant colors pop out, and no background feels too realistic. They all match the atmosphere and style. The animation actually took 2 years to master. That's insane. The speedy style that Sony excels with fits perfectly in a superhero movie, and it never gets to a point where it's too fast paced. The character design is great too. They don't just go for the standard style of trying to make everyone look cute and rubbery. They all have unique designs that fit their character perfectly. Some are designed like 2D, some are designed like anime, some are designed out of the ordinary. I love how this movie looks. That's all I can really say. It deserves to be shown in an art museum. It excels on every level to make this the best looking animated film I've ever seen. Yes, really. The voice cast is perfect as well. Shamik Moore fits perfectly with Miles' chill personality. Jake Johnson adds a new layer of personality for Peter Parker. Haley Steinfeld puts on a perfect mood for Gwen Stacy. John Mulaney brings out a comedic marvel with Spider-Ham. And my personal favorite, Nicolas Cage voicing Spider-Man Noir. That is perfect casting, as good as Jack Black cast as Poe. The soundtrack is amazing as well. Almost every tune fits the sequences flawlessly and definitely sounds like something from Spider-Man. However, there are a few songs that don't really fit and sound more like something from a pop star than anything Spider-Man related, but that didn't bother me because the instrumentals are pleasing to my ears. Honestly, I don't even know what else I can say about this movie. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse really is as good as everybody says it is, and I must give a huge round of applause to the crew behind this movie since it won the Oscar award for Best Animated Film. Take that, Disney! This movie feels like a tribute to animation's entire history. It feels like a love letter to fans of Spider-Man, and I know Stan Lee would be fucking proud of it. This isn't just the best animated film of 2018, or one of my favorite animated films of all time, but the best Spider-Man movie ever made. This was a perfect way to finish up 2018, and the wait was definitely worth it. And when this movie comes out on 4K Blu-ray, you know damn well I'm picking that up. And we're getting a Steelbook edition. I'll give Sony as much money as I can for this movie. And that was Animation Explosion for 2019. Now that everything is done and dusted, if I were to rank these movies from top to bottom, best to worst, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, as I just said, Isle of Dogs for how well constructed it was, Incredibles 2 for being a worthy follow-up, the Teen Titans Go movie for being a pleasant surprise, Smallfoot for being a decent movie with an inspiring message, Hotel Transylvania 3 because it's just another one of those, Sergeant Stubby, despite the tone not really fitting with a kids movie, Early Man because of how disappointing it was, Ralph Breaks the Internet for how much worse it made the characters, Sherlock Gnomes for just being a mediocre kids film, Duck Duck Goose because it's just a Netflix movie, nothing to really scream about in terms of how bad it is, and finally The Grinch for being such an awful representation of the original plot with so much pointlessness thrown in. Overall, this year was just okay. Only 5 movies I considered good, with only one being a standout awful movie. It's hard to say whether this or 2017 was better, but they both had around the same quality of movies, with this year having less. As for what 2019 has in store, I'm not that excited. Okay, well, I've already seen How to Train Your Dragon 3, but the other movies don't leave much excitement for me. I mean, maybe Toy Story 4 could be good, and I'm sure the Lego Movie 2 will be a fun ride, and heck, I'm even excited for Frozen 2. But I sure as hell have no excitement for the rest. I mean, Ugly Dolls is probably going to be a bad Trolls ripoff, and I'm definitely not looking forward to Secret Life of Pets 2. But we'll have to wait and see. I'll review all those movies when Animation Explosion returns in March 2020. Thank you guys so much for sticking through this marathon once again, and feel free to share your thoughts on the movies I talked about in the comments section. But until next time, keep on playing! Taking the top spot on the voting poll, it's the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. If you're a Yoshi Player veteran, you probably don't know that my history on SpongeBob has been hit and miss. SpongeBob was one of the first cartoons I ever saw as a kid, with the first two being Pingu and Tom and Jerry. But SpongeBob was a cartoon I used to watch a fair amount of the time, yet could only watch them on DVD since our cables didn't have Nickelodeon. I played the PS2 games and loved them, rewatched the episodes countless times, but stopped after season 4. I don't like the show anymore, so where does that leave this movie? Well, I can safely say that, even after 10 years, this movie still holds up incredibly well. If you haven't seen the show, which is unlikely at this point, it stars an anthropomorphic sea sponge named SpongeBob who lives in a pineapple under the sea. He has his best friend Patrick, his grouchy neighbor Squidward, and his favorite job at the Krusty Krab making Krabby Patties, which he's particularly excited about because the owner, Mr. Krabs, is opening up a new Krusty Krab right next to the original. I love when movies do something like that. SpongeBob hopes to become the manager of the Krusty Krab too, but Mr. Krabs instead gives the role to Squidward, believing that SpongeBob doesn't have the responsibility to do so given his childlike behavior. Elsewhere, Mr. Krabs' restaurant rival Plankton has stolen the crown of King Neptune and frames Krabs for it. SpongeBob decides to save his boss's life by traveling to Shell City with Patrick to obtain the crown, unaware that Plankton is planning to take over Bikini Bottom. You know, when I was rewatching this movie in today's time, it really surprised me how similar this movie is to the My Little Pony movie that I talked about last March. Both movies are 2D animated, both are based on popular TV shows, both have stories about the main characters and their friends going on a road trip, and that road trip is usually because they need to retrieve some sort of valuable item, both have evil villains who take over the hero's home, and both movies have a climax where the hero uses the movie's main lesson to defeat the villain. But I feel as though the main difference between the two all comes down to the execution. SpongeBob was willing to embrace its wacky and goofy tone to make the story fun and interesting. Meanwhile, the My Little Pony movie just felt so safe and standard. Need I bring up how tedious the music got? Part of the reason this movie sticks out more is how much of an identity SpongeBob has already set at this point. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure My Little Pony has its own identity, but where else will you see a show about sea creatures with out-of-the-ordinary creatures and wacky visual style? Well, that's where the SpongeBob movie shines the most. The visuals get really creative to turn this otherwise basic road trip film into a fun, action-packed adventure. It's the out-of-ordinary aspect to make it stand out, such as how SpongeBob runs into this old lady and turns out to be a monster, SpongeBob defeating Plankton by performing a damn rock number, or fucking David Hasselhoff helping SpongeBob and Patrick get home whilst a fight is happening on his ass. If this isn't enough to draw you into this movie, I don't know what will. Speaking of which, the comedy of SpongeBob has worked its way well into a feature-length film. Most of the jokes are very funny thanks to the witty dialogue, visual style, and scenes that sometimes contain musical numbers. Can some of the jokes get old? Sure. Do jokes tend to go on too long? Absolutely. But I can skim past that when I'm literally spending a good chunk of this movie laughing along at how stupid things can get. This movie feels very self-aware in a lot of areas. It knows deep down it's a stupid idea with childish integrations, but it has just enough in there to the point where even adults can enjoy this movie. The animation style is integrated wonderfully into the cinema world. Everyone has their own unique design and no one feels so dead or generic. Unlike, say, seasons 4 to 8 of SpongeBob, it's clear that the animators had a blast working on this movie, and the effort really shows in the lives given to these iconic characters. Now, how you judge them is more so how you felt about them if you've ever seen the show. For example, if you can't tolerate SpongeBob's overly happy attitude or Squidward's grouchy selfish tone, then I doubt the movie's going to do you any better with the cast. Me personally, one thing I absolutely want a movie to do is to get me to love all the characters, which is what the SpongeBob movie manages to achieve. Hell, my only complaint with the characters is that some of the side characters like Sandy, Mrs. Puff, or Larry barely appear in this movie. Hell, we don't even get Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, or Patchy the Pirate during the live action scenes. I mean, they have pirates in the first place, why isn't he even there? But probably my biggest flaw with this movie is Plankton. Not in terms of the character himself. I love how despite how tiny he is, he can still pose as a legitimate threat, and he certainly has plenty of goofy, funny moments as well. No, my main issue with Plankton is his plan in general. We know that Plankton has always wanted to obtain the Krabby Patty formula and overthrow Mr. Krabs in the business scene, but when in the show was it ever implied that he wanted to take over the world? I know he can be really evil and whatnot, but this sudden world domination plan felt like it just came out of nowhere because we needed to make Plankton a scarier threat. As a result, it kind of turns him into a rather cliched villain with an obvious motivation behind it all. Despite that though, I still think the SpongeBob movie is very solid. And just to clear things up right now, this is far better than the second SpongeBob movie I talked about a few years ago. Even if I'm not a fan of the show anymore, the movie is still something I like to go back on if I'm in the mood for it. It's wacky, it's funny, it's iconic, it's weird, it's stupid. It's SpongeBob SquarePants. To me, this movie is a great example of turning a television cartoon into a cinematic feature, and even if you've never seen the movie, or the show for that matter, check it out. Maybe you'll get more into the show if you do. Seasons 1 to 3 of course. Ignore everything else. I guess all I can say to end this review is, thank you Mr. Hillenberg for the endless memories you left us and the impact your show left on the cartoon community in general. Coming in second place on my voting poll, it's WreckIt Ralph. If you saw my animation explosion video on Ralph Breaks the Internet, then you're well aware that I wasn't a big fan of it. In fact, nowadays, I would consider the movie outright bad. While not awful, it missed a lot of the marks that could have made a great sequel. The characters and story were mostly what ruined it for me. But it's refreshing since I can go back and rewatch the original movie, which is what we're going to be talking about today. In an arcade, all video game characters can travel from their machines into a central station where they can all meet and travel. One of these games is known as Fix-It Felix Jr., the villain being WreckIt Ralph, but he feels like he's unappreciated as the bad guy of his game and wants to show that he's important. So he travels to another game called Hero's Duty and wins a medal, but ends up losing it in another game called Sugar Rush, where he meets a racer named Penelope. She's actually a glitch in her world, and nobody will let her race because of it. So the two decide to make a deal with each other. If Ralph can help her get into the race and win, she'll give him his medal back, which she actually used to participate. So the big selling point of this movie was that it was featuring a lot of familiar arcade games that have, ever since their release, become iconic. I mean, when you think of arcade games, you think of games like Pac-Man and Cubert and Street Fighter. I'll admit that did seem like an easy way to draw people in because, believe it or not, the characters aren't in most of the movie. But I don't feel that's where the heart of the movie stands. What does stand is the story and characters. If you had all these characters completely made up without any familiar faces, the story wouldn't change. However, the fact that this is a video game movie gives the writers and directors a chance to play around more with what's given to them, like how characters use cheat codes to change their appearance or to access secret areas. If you're a video gamer like myself, you're bound to notice plenty of small details in this film. It's honestly rare for an animated movie to give me a cast of characters where I can love every single one of them. They each have their own unique attributes and arcs to make them seem more three-dimensional, which for a movie about video games is wonderful. Since I complained so much about Ralph and Penelope in the sequel, I should talk more about them here. I mentioned that Ralph was a character that felt more natural and smart in this movie, and that statement hasn't changed since then. He may occasionally make mistakes and can be a bit of a doofus, but he has this more cynical and sarcastic side to him that's warmed up throughout the film as his friendship with Penelope grows more and more. His development flows naturally and nothing about his traits come off as jarring. Plus, he's not a fucking idiot, thankfully. As for Penelope, while she still can be a bit of a brat, she's got this soft side to her, since she wants to fit in so badly with the other races of the game. Nobody really likes her that much, and some even want her outright gone. It's a dark contrast to Ralph's story arc, where even though he's seen as a villain, at least he is seen as somewhat of a purpose. This is what makes their friendship so much stronger, because their story arcs contrast each other's to get them closer. They both see value in each other, and both act like how normal friends would. Felix may be the respected hero of his game, but I like how he still shows this respect and care for Ralph despite how everybody else feels about him. Calhoun is a hilarious character who proves to be a real badass, partly thanks to her backstory, which I dare not spoil, and King Candy is one of the better twist villains of modern Disney movies. Not necessarily because he's a bad guy, but because of something else that I won't spoil here. Every character has worked well into the story, which isn't too complicated to follow, even if you're not a gamer like myself. My only gripe with WreckIt Ralph? Well, even though I mentioned that the movie's true heart stems from the plot and characters and not all the other cameos, I still kinda wish we got more of them throughout the movie. How awesome would it have been to see some of them appear as friends or partners of the main characters? Hell, it would have been even cooler if they showed up in the climax. I would have loved to see some of them helping fight off the bad guys, like seeing Street Fighter characters using their powers, or maybe even have villains helping too, like Bowser sending his henchmen to fight. That would have been badass. And it would have at least made the climax more exciting, which, while not bad, could have used some more exciting set pieces or obstacles in the way. Other than that though, WreckIt Ralph is a very smart movie with a clever story, lovable characters, beautiful animation, and plenty of references and cameos to keep the video game fans busy. If you haven't checked it out yet, you're doing yourself a disservice. Please go check it out if you have the time, but if you do enjoy it, do yourself another favor and avoid the sequel, okay? Okay. Coming in third place on my voting poll, and the last movie I'm going to be taking a look at for Animation Explosion in general this year, it's Shrek. Yes, in the times before the series became a joke to memes and trends alike, seriously, it's stupid. Shrek was one of the biggest things to come out in animation history. The franchise kickstarted a new direction for DreamWorks to take, and unfortunately, a trend for other studios to try and replicate. It had all the tools most animation studios use for films today. Adult humor, pointless comic reliefs, dance party endings, but here's the question. Is there a reason Shrek caused this trend in the first place? Shrek is an ogre who lives in a swamp all by himself, enjoying the independence and being gross while scaring off anyone who comes into his land. But one night, a group of fairy tale creatures have showed up on Shrek's swamp because a ruler known as Lord Farquaad wants them off his property. Shrek goes to complain about it, and the two make a deal. Farquaad wants to marry a princess known as Fiona so he can become king. So if Shrek can get her for him, he'll get rid of all the fairy tale creatures from his land. Shrek is accompanied by a donkey, literally named Donkey, and goes to get the princess. So it's important to know that at its core, Shrek is a movie that basically says fuck you to Disney. It takes all the cliches that Disney's been known for, especially since it's coming off the Renaissance era, and does the complete opposite in all those areas. Whenever the movie feels as though it's going to go in the Disney formula, it completely shits on itself. And I feel that's what gives Shrek such a unique identity. It's not an adult movie, but it's a huge risk taker. Practically everything Shrek sets out to do works brilliantly in its favor, and it can feel like a breath of fresh air for those who want something different than the Disney formula, which was even replicated a lot during the 90s. But I don't feel that's all what makes Shrek stand out. The writing and character help it out a lot. The adult jokes and innuendos never come across as forced and flow naturally throughout the movie, and given the style the movie sets, that helps in applying the adult jokes as well. Of course, that's not to say all the jokes work. There's a handful that come off as unnecessary or just plain stupid, but that doesn't happen very often. I love this movie's art style. Every character looks distinct and recognizable, the backgrounds go for a more realistic setting, and there's not a single ounce of stiff movement or sloppy work done to it at all. For 2001, the humans look damn impressive, since humans done in Pixar movies tend to look more plastic and stiff compared to this. None of the characters act fluffy-duffy. They don't hesitate to drop a few jabs and inappropriate behavior, but to me, it never got to a point where it was annoying. Shrek may seem like a nasty ogre who hates everyone, but you get to see the soft side in his character. He hates being rejected by practically everyone and just wants someone to appreciate him not for his appearance but for his personality. There's a reason the comic relief trope's been replicated so much, because Donkey was the birth child of that trope. He may seem like a pointless character who doesn't serve much to the story, but A, he's actually funny, B, he actually helps Shrek in his quest, and C, he actually has input in the story where he learns a secret behind Fiona's curse. And it helps that he never annoys me either. Eddie Murphy pulls off an outstanding performance. The rest of the characters do a serviceable job to the story. Fiona's a nice enough princess who won't hesitate to get real buff and badass whenever something doesn't go her way. And while Farquaad may not be one of the better animated villains, he still provides plenty of funny enough moments and is a crux between Shrek and Fiona's bond. Actually, speaking of which, I think it's time to address what everybody's complained about most with this movie. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen it. Go to this time mark if you want to skip it. Fiona has a curse where she turns into an ogre at night. Donkey talks to her about it, and she thinks of her form as a hideous beast. But when Shrek eavesdrops, he thinks she's talking about him. This leads to a big misunderstanding between the two, and yeah, I agree with everybody said. It drags the movie with unnecessary drama that could have been done a lot better or removed completely. For a movie that loves to poke fun at Disney cliches, it doesn't realize it's using other cliches that bring it down. That being said, the movie does have a brilliant message on the true love formula, as you don't need to look beautiful in order to be a beautiful princess in general. I also feel that the movie can get very slow at certain points. There's a huge number of scenes that just focus on the characters talking and cracking jokes. While I appreciate it for growing the relationship between them, I feel they go on for far too long. There's really only a few scenes that come across as exciting and adventurous, such as the dragon fight scene, the Robin Hood fight, or even the final fight against Farquaad. I don't mind when movies take a slower pace, but I feel Shrek could have done it a lot better. Other than those flaws, I'd have to say that Shrek is pretty great. I wouldn't say it's outright amazing or a masterpiece like some people say it is. I personally think Shrek 2 is a far better movie, but I do see why Shrek's become a cult classic. It tried something different and it stood out as a result. While I wish studios would stop trying to be like Shrek, we can't forget why Shrek became such a hit to begin with. Despite being the fuck you to Disney, it had its own strengths to make it a great film to watch. while it's hard to say if it's for everyone or not, I recommend checking it out. And that is basically it for Animation Explosion in general for 2019. Thanks to everybody who voted on what movies they wanted me to review this month, and thanks for watching up to this point. I look forward to returning to the main Animation Explosion videos in March 2020, when I take a look at all the animated movies that came out this year, and by popular demand will certainly return as well in May 2020. Until then though, thank you guys so much for watching and supporting, and keep on playing!